Welcome to our first shir on Sefer Yechezkel. Over the course of our learning, we are going to be using a couple of different people and sources. I just want to note that at the beginning. So Dr. Tova Genzel has a wonderful parish on the whole book of Yechezkel on VBM Torah. That's the Gush website. And I will draw from her summaries and her shiurim.
What's VBM stand for?
Virtual Beit Midrash.
Oh, Rabbi Luke.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the second source is when I was in YU, I studied with Rabbi Chaim Angel, and he is an incredible Tanakh teacher, and I have my notes, and my friend Willie Roth's notes from that class, as well as a lot of my material from there. Also, he wrote up some of the things that he taught in articles that I've also kind of went back and reviewed. And then I've just been reading introductions and other things of different places and the Rishonim themselves. The one Rishon I'd like to kind of highlight is Rav Elazar Belgian C. He is not normally one that people come across so often. He was a student of the Rashbam. He is part of that school that is very hyper pshat centric. He does not mention any midrashim. It's not at all kind of in his wheelhouse. He was a French parshan. He was actually the second generation of Tosafists. He's an important commentary for a couple of different books of Tanakh, including Yechezkel. I think Yeshayahu. He also has an important parish in some of the Treyasar. So at least that's what we have extant. So he's an important player that we'll come across at different times. You may not have heard of him before, so I figured I would introduce him. And then we have the usual suspects. We have Rashi, we have Radak, we have the Barbanel, and some others. Yes, I wouldn't sit there. And so we have all of those people as well that we will come across over our time
Who was the
together.
first person at the Gush? The first
So
person?
Dr. Tova Genzel.
Tova.
Yeah.
All ones.
Okie dokie. So now that we got the kind of where all of this material is being culled from, we're just going to get started a little bit. So the book of Yechezkel covers probably 22 years. One of the things that's really interesting about the book of Yechezkel, which is one of the things we're going to deal with a little bit today, probably the main thing that we're going to spend time doing today, is that the way that this book is dated is a little bit interesting. There's first of all, a lot of it is dated back to the exile of Yechonia, but there are other numbers that kind of play into this, which make it a little bit confusing in trying to figure out exactly what took place when. So just to give you one example, so there's a set of prophecies about different nations, but for the end prophecies. The end prophecies are about the temple. Chapters 40 to 48 are about the temple. So those end prophecies take place 20 years after the beginning prophecies, because the dates are the exact same context. And we're going to talk about that in a few minutes also. The first prophecy takes place 5 years after the exile of Yechonia, and then the next one takes place 25 years after the exile of Yechonia, exactly 20 years later. But there's a section about Egypt in particular that talks about 27 years something, and it's not clear whether that's also 27 years after the exile of Yechonia, which would be 2 years later than that later prophecy, or if it's 27 years after some other event. It's unclear. So if it is in fact 27 years after the exile of Yechonia, then the entirety of the book, all the prophecies of Yechezkel take up 22 years. If not, then it's 20 years. Okay, that's the debate a little bit, but it's not a very long period of time. It's a very focused period of time. And the very interesting thing about Yechezkel is that the whole book takes place in Galut Bavel, right? He starts off in Galut Bavel, he ends in Galut Bavel, even though there's to some extent there's this prophecy about the going back and the Beit HaMikdash and everything else, but it's an exile book. Now, there's an interesting discussion in the Gemara, so the Gemara that everybody likes to quote every single time you talk about authorship of a book. So it's the Gemara of Bava Batra, Daf Yudalit Amud Bet, going on to Tezvav Amud Aleph. So that section of Bava Batra talks about who wrote the books. So when it comes to Yechezkel, you'd expect that who wrote the book?
Yechezkel.
That's what you'd think, right? So when you look at the Gemara says the Anshe Knesset Sagdola wrote Yechezkel, and Rashi says, if there's an interesting Rashi there, he quotes 5 people. He says Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, Mordechai, and I don't remember one other person. I'll come to me. So these are 5 people in the Anshe Knesset Sagdola that put together the book of Yechezkel, and some might ask, why? Like, why is the book of Yechezkel, right, not written by Yechezkel? So the simple answer, which is actually a very controversial answer, is that prophecy doesn't really happen outside of Eretz Yisrael unless it's about Eretz Yisrael. But then even when that prophecy is written down, it has to be written down in Eretz Yisrael. Now that's complicated for a lot of reasons. First of all, that means you have to argue that the entirety of Yechezkel's prophecy is about Eretz Yisrael, which a lot of it is, but still that's a jump you have to make. Second of all, Yirmiyahu also prophesies outside of Israel, and most likely he writes his own book, because that's what we believe. He wrote his own book according to the Gemara, and he never makes it back to Israel. So how you justify that piece within this framework, I don't know. But that's kind of a perspective that exists. The Kuzari is one of the people who really highlights this, and it's not surprising. He's someone who's very much into the kind of the uniqueness and the specialty of Am Yisrael, the Neshama of Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael. It's very much in his wheelhouse for this to kind of fit in his overall ideology. But just something that I came across, so just keeping that in mind.
So, question about that then. Is there an idea that his prophecies are written down piecemeal by a scribe, for example, and then assembled later by...
Good. So that's where I actually came across this really fascinating other part, or this other perspective. So it's against the simple reading of the Gemara, which is why it's controversial. But I came across, his name is Yitzchak Halevi. So he was apparently a tea merchant, and he went bankrupt. And he was friends with Rav Chaim Brisker. He was connected with the whole entire Brisker. He actually was the gabbai in the Volozhin Yeshiva, and he actually is the founder of the Agudah Israel, the Agudah movement. He kind of hatched the idea in his living room, and had a whole bunch of rabbis, including Rav Kook, come and help him to put together the Agudah Israel. His tombstone, his matzeva, was actually written by Rav Kook. I did a lot of research on him last night because I came across him and I was fascinated by who this guy was. And I plan on doing maybe like a little, maybe one of my Shabbos mornings, I'm going to spend some time on him. But he wrote a book called The Dorot Harishonim, which was a response to Hirsch and Gratz and the other Wissenschaft von Judentums, the scholars of history who were part of the Reform movement, who were trying to justify the Reform movement based off just Jewish history. So he wrote a traditional response to how the Gemara was compiled and everything else, and other aspects of history. Fascinating person. And he actually says exactly that. He says that Yechezkel must have written down his prophecies to some extent, right, when he had them. And then they were compiled and put into a book form by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, which is very appealing in terms of an approach, because again, I think our instinct tells us who wrote Yechezkel, right? I think that's part of it, but that's just the little bit of introduction in terms of who wrote the book. Fine.
So were all those people that you mentioned exiled at the same time
In
to
terms of-
Babylonia? The people you said that were possible sources that could have written it if he didn't?
Or they either were exiled at that point or at some soon thereafter, later point, but they were there with him.
Because they talk about how there was a community there already
Yeah.
established and all that.
Yeah. You got... Okay, good. Okay, so...
Mordechai was
To the left, to the right,
was
David.
ever in Israel?
Mordechai
So
was.
Mordechai, I think what you're asking. He was in Israel?
It's possible.
Okay,
Yeah, he was part of
Israel?
he was part of the Sanhedrin. So yeah, once upon a time he was part of the Sanhedrin.
Prior to going to
Yeah,
Persia.
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
The Megillah said he was part of the exile of
Yeah, the Megillah says it, right? He was part of.
the exile.
I'm
Im
just
Yechon
thinking, I'm
Yamech
trying to place
Yehuda.
Yechezkel, right?
Yeah, he
Yechezkel
was.
Before, then was before the that's why I'm asking.
So Yechezkel was before what?
But Yechezkel happened then after the exile, no?
Yeah, 5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm saying, so when Mordechai go back to Israel, that's what I'm asking. Or
In
was that
theory.
important at all?
No. So yeah, it is important. They do go back, meaning with Daryavesh, when right after.
Yavish is like
post-
70 years.
Yeah, so post Achashverosh. I don't know exactly how he whether meaning in terms of the Eretz Yisrael piece of this.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so that piece I'm still working on for a lot of reasons. But yeah, so I think the impression is that somehow they made it back
Interesting.
to Israel to write this down. That's the meaning. If you're going that line of thinking,
Right.
you have to go all the way with it. But
Right.
yeah,
You say Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi were in Eretz Yisrael for sure, right?
yeah. I don't meaning at the end of it, at least towards the meaning they may have been outside at first, but then
Right. There's, we assumed that they went to Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, and they probably were a little bit after Yechezkel, meaning they overlapped with Yechezkel, but they were younger and then outlived Yechezkel.
Just wouldn't easy to include Mordechai in the list, that's all.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, great. So, what I would like to do is, right, so, right, so just to review again, even though I think all of us were part of the Malachim class, but let's just review a little bit. So, if you recall, Nebuchadnezzar had rid himself of Yehoiachin's father. So Yoshiyahu, right, Joachim's grandfather, right, the one who found the Torah and created the big movement of Reformation, though they were still doing things behind closed doors, etc. So his son Joachim ruled for a short period of time, and then he died right before being captured. So Joachim was the king for 3 months before he was sent into exile. And then his, right, Tzidkiyahu was put in his place, and that was kind of the beginning of the end for the kings. So you have this end period is a pretty disruptive period for the Jewish people. And one of the things that's interesting to think about is from the Babylonian perspective, most likely the exiling of Yehoiachin is like what they would say is the beginning of the like when they think about the Chorban, right? When they think about the destruction from the Babylonian perspective, they took the king out of Israel and brought him to Babylon. That was probably for them, right? And then they installed a new king that was kind of their vassal, Tzidkiyahu. So from their perspective, that was the end. Even though Tzidkiyahu lasts a little period longer, and then Gedaliah is set up as governor, and only after that is everything kind of get just totally destroyed completely, and there's no more Jews in Israel. But we kind of take the Jews' perspective, right? Because one of the things that we highlighted in the book of Melachim was the Jews thought that the Beit HaMikdash was indestructible, and that Sancherib had proven that you can't destroy it. He'd had hundreds of thousands of soldiers drop dead outside the walls. Until the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, right, the Jews believed the Beit HaMikdash is indestructible. What's interesting is that Yechezkel is talking to the exiles with Yehoiachin, right? And we're going to see next week, right, that we're going to talk about the Ma'aseh Merkavah to an extent, right? The chariot of fire that Yechezkel sees, this incredibly glorious vision of God. And the whole notion of that vision is that God left Israel, right? And that God left the Beit HaMikdash. And that there, right, with the exile of Yehoiachin to some extent, there already was a leaving from Israel way before the actual destruction, which the Gemara talks about, that when Titus comes in and stabs the paroches and it starts to bleed, he says, I killed your God, right? And the Gemara responds, no, that you just destroyed, right, stones and sticks, but the Beit HaMikdash, God had already left the Beit HaMikdash way before, otherwise you would never have been able to, right, do what you did. So the vision of Yechezkel and the perspective of Yechezkel for the Jews who went to Bavel is actually very similar to the Babylonian perspective in terms of what the end was, so to speak. Not yet. You'll see Yechezkel has to kind of convince them of that. Right?
So he prophesies before the temple's destroyed. Is that
Yes,
right?
yes. This is in the fifth, right, if you're doing the math, in the 5th year of Yehoiachin's exile. Yehoiachin is exiled significantly before the Beit HaMikdash is actually destroyed, because you have all of Tidkiyahu's reign, and is there anyone? Tidkiyahu was 11 years. Was 11 years? How long did he?
Before that.
11 years. So you have at least 6 more years before the Beit HaMikdash is actually destroyed. When this takes place, and even after Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, you still have Gedaliah post that. So we have a period of time, even after that, where there's still Jews in Israel, and we're going to see over the course of the book that those Jews, the Jews in Israel always seem to view themselves as, no, we're still the guys who God's going to kind of continue on the Jewish people with, even though it ends up being these Jews who are thrown out with the King Yehoiah, who end up coming back eventually in rebuilding. So it's really this interesting dynamic that Yechezkel is trying to teach and educate his generation, that why everything took place, what took place, why it took place, and that inspire them that they will be able to go back. One of the really interesting things about Yechezkel, which we'll have to talk about at some much later point, is the lack of calling for teshuvah in the book of Yechezkel, which is a really interesting dynamic also, and everyone has their own take on that a little bit, but I'm just going to throw it out there as a teaser at this point. We'll have to kind of take a look when those things actually come out.
Can you just approximately how many people, or percentage-wise, of the nation was exiled with Yehoiachin? Because it would seem it was small, no?
So I think it was tens of thousands. I think not hundreds of thousands. I think it was tens of thousands of the nobles. It may actually say.
And his address was to these people, or to the people currently in Israel. And when Yechezkel was prophesying, I assume he was prophesying to the tens of thousands who were then in Babel. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So it was a relative minority.
Yeah.
Of the people he was
Yeah.
prophesying.
It was the like the highest echelons of society who were exiled. Meaning it was
Right.
the king and all the princes and all the people who were kind of important, who were the people who were thrown out. But yeah, it wasn't a majority of people at that point.
Excuse my ignorance. Where was Yirmiyahu? When did he come in?
Yirmiyahu is, give me 1 second. Yirmiyahu is before Yechezkel, both in timeline and in content. Yirmiyahu is during Yoshiyahu. Right, Vayikonein Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. Right, that meaning that's the kina that we read. Yirmiyahu was the prophet during Yoshiyahu's time period.
And Yirmiyahu goes to Egypt.
Yeah, at the end.
Yirmiyahu is the one, he goes.
So there's no overlapping between the two? I thought.
Not sure. It's possible there was. I'm not sure exactly. I may have to do the math.
Because Yirmiyahu would have been the one prophesying to those left in Israel, right, to the masses, so to speak, if there was an overlap. It's just interesting how that would all play out.
Could it also be that Yechezkel didn't start prophesying until he got to Babel? So
Rashi Lishitaso says the prophet can't start his prophecies in Chutz La'aretz, so it must be he had other prophecies in Israel. They weren't important Ladorot, but that is all fits with that whole perspective about Israel and prophecy. Well, it's fine. Most likely not. But again, there are plenty of prophets who don't even have books because their prophecies were not relevant to the Dorot, so it's definitely possible. Fine. So let's get started with the book itself. We're going to do just the first 3 verses and have a pretty long conversation about those first 3 verses with an emphasis on one particular detail, and then we'll close for today. So, Vayhi b'shloshim shana b'revi b'chamisha l'chodesh Va'ani besoch ha'gola al nahar kvar niftechu hashamayim ve'ereh mar'os elokim. So it was bishloshim shana, in the 30th year, B'revi'i, in the 4th month, b'chamisha lachodesh, in the 5th of the month, v'ani b'toch ha'gola, I'm a part of the galut, and I'm standing by Nahar Kvar, and the skies open up, and I saw this incredible vision of God. B'chamisha lachodesh hi hashana chamishit legalut hamelech Yoyachin, and this 5th of the month took place on the 5th year since, right, the galut of the king Yoyachin. Hayo haya dvar Hashem el Yechezkel ben Buzi hakohen be'eretz Kazdim al Nahar Kvar v'ati alav sham yad Hashem. Right, so you have Yechezkel ben Buzi receiving prophecy. Interestingly, he was a kohen, right, a prophet priest, which is going to be very important for a lot of the themes that we will see in the book of Yechezkel, which is why it comes up in this, what I would say, koteret, kind of this introductory timeline statement of the beginning of the book. And, right, it's in the land of the Kasdians, on, right, Nahar Kvar, which you already mentioned, and that's where God appeared to him. And next week we're going to try to get through some, at least, of the basic understanding of what exactly he sees. Exactly how much justice we'll do to it, you guys will let me know. But that's what we're going to try and deal with next week. But for now, there's one word or one little timepiece that is very unclear. Does anyone know which part is particularly unclear? Yeah.
30th year.
Bishloshim
of what?
Shana, in the 30th year of what? In the 30th year of what? Like, what's the... That's very strange. You normally, you have, right? He Hashana Chamishit legalut melech Yoyachin. That's what. Okay, you have the 5th year from the galut. So what's the 30th year? So there's a head scratcher, and everyone has like their own take on it. So midrashically, we're going to start with the midrash's perspective. So the midrashically, the perspective that the midrash highlights is that it has to do with Yovel, that it's actually the 30th year in the Yovel cycle. So that means in 20 years, right, you'll have the end of the Yovel cycle, which, by the way, is the prophecy that he gives when, right, that's the prophecy of the temple, 20 years later, 25 years after. So if you go to chapter 40, verse 1. Yeah.
1303.
1302, 1303. Be'esrim v'chamesh shana legalosenu berosh hashana be'esor lachodesh be'arba asrei shana achar asher huksa ha'ir be'etzem hayom hazeh haysa alai yad Hashem v'yaveh oti shama. So 14 years after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, 25 years after the exile, which puts it 20 years after our start date, right? Because this was 5 years after, 25 years after, so 20 years later. And what happens? So this is when he starts giving a whole prophecy about what the next Beit HaMikdash will look like. So there's an interesting, this is, by the way, the only place in all of Tanakh where the words Rosh Hashanah appear. And there's a really interesting conversation about how you understand this verse, right? Barosh Hashanah be'asor lachodesh. On Rosh Hashanah, the 10th of the month. Last I checked, Rosh Hashanah, is not Yom Kippur. Last I checked, except once every 50 years, where we view Yom Kippurim like the beginning of the year, and that is on the Yovel year. So the Chazal in the Gemara of Erechin uses this text to explain how Mai Rosh Hashanah, right, the 10th of the month. How could that be? Must be this is a Yovel year. So let's do some math. That means that at the beginning, the 30th year, right, is dating it based off of Yovel. What is Yovel?
Jubilee.
What happens in Yovel?
Years.
What?
All the land
All the land goes back to the original owners. So imagine you're talking to a people who just lost Eretz Yisrael, and right, how do you date your book? You date your book based off of Yovel, when all the ancestral heritage will return back to them. It's a really inspiring, right, type of message to the people. Don't worry. Like, yes, we're in exile right now, but we will return. One day we will come back. Yeah.
How do we know it's not a deer?
It's not what?
Aviv, I'm sorry.
What do you mean?
Nisan.
Oh, good. So Rav Eliezer Belgian see the Pashtan, right? The one who likes only Pshat, doesn't like Midrash. He says in all the Torah, Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, is not Tishrei. It's Nisan. It's Nisan. So he says this is wrong. You can't say that. At least on the Pshat level, he says you can't say that. That's a great question. So he says no, that's not what's going on here, because that doesn't work. What's really cool, though, for him is that, well, think about it. What does that mean? So that means that the 10th of Nisan was when the Jews leave Egypt. That's the first day they leave, right? I mean, sorry, it's like that's when they start collecting, right? They're starting to get the lamb.
lambs.
Yeah, the lamb, right? The lamb starts at that date, and then, right, a couple days later, they're going to slaughter that lamb and leave. But it's right. It connects it more to the Exodus, right? To the leaving. Which, even if you want to go that route, right, you still have a similar type of inspiring message, right? That it's right. At least when they're giving the Beit HaMikdash talk, right? Right. We're going to go back. Right. We're going to leave, so to speak. We're going to be able to return. So it doesn't help us in the beginning, but at least in the end. Right, you get a little bit of inspiration even in the Pshat reading that it's actually referring to Nisan. So according to Eliezer Belgian C, or the people who don't necessarily like the Yovel idea, so then what's the 30th year? Okay, so one suggestion that's given is that it's the fact that he's 30 years old. Now, nowhere else, the Center of Cook, I forgot who wrote this one. Yechiel Tzvi Mushkovitz. So he put together this particular one of this set. So he points out in a footnote that Ein Ach V'Reya, there is no sibling or friend to the assumption that he was 30 years old. Meaning nowhere else in the entire Tanakh does this type of language of Bishloshim Shana, right? Is that an age of a person, and that's how it's written. That's just not the normal way of writing it. But for a second, let's run with it. So if he's 30 years old, why is that significant? Does anyone know? So let's jump to Bamidbar Perek Daled. This is the counting of the tribe of Levi. Moshe page 332. Naso et rosh b'nei kahas b'toch b'nei Levi l'mishposam v'esavosam, and then it's mi ben shloshim shana v'mala ad ben chamishim shana. Right, that's the counting of the tribe of Levi, because that's when the Levites, the Kohanim, did their service. Their service was from age 30 to age 50. So you have the Kohen Navi, who was thrown out of Israel with the king Yoyachin, right? And assuming that he's 30 years old, this would have been what? When he started his service in the Beit HaMikdash. And he has this prophecy about God leaving the Beit HaMikdash. And then 20 years later, in Parak Arba'im, when he has his prophecy about the rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, he is 50 years old, and that would be when he would be finishing his service in the Beit HaMikdash. Right? And so you have, right, another way of breaking this down with a really interesting kind of, and that also might be why that prophecy that's 27 years later about Egypt is not at the end. There's also a whole bunch of thematic prophecies about other nations that come together as a cluster. But to have this beginning and end, right, these bookends for the Kohen Navi, I think is a really kind of beautiful frame for the book. Good.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Is what about the idea of where it says in the 30th year, and then it says Baravi, but it doesn't really say it in the 4th month.
Yeah, that's how
Is that, but we have to, does anyone say anything about that, or just like everyone
everyone who I saw says
infers-
month. Says it's
infers-
Tammuz.
right.
It's the 5th Tammuz, yeah.
Are there other places that you know of in Nach that are so oblique?
What?
Other places in Nach where that they're so oblique,
Mm.
the way that they meant that they. stick
Not
the
that I
month
know
in
of.
there.
Not that I know of. And the truth is, Rav Elazar Belgency, in his introduction to Sefer Yechezkel, says figuring out exactly what he's talking about in a lot of places is really complicated. That's kind of a one of the things that he says in talking about Yechezkel. He says sometimes it's a very long book, but he says sometimes he's very brief and terse, and he means to say a lot, but he doesn't say a lot. And sometimes it's not 100% clear exactly what we're supposed to be learning from certain things. It's a very interesting way to introduce a book when you're starting.
Can I offer one other interpretation on that 30 years? I'm wondering if the reigns of the kings determine what the numbering of the year.
Normally.
And if a king is exiled and no new king gets to start the new calendar clock running, do they just keep the clock running on the old king's number of years?
So, what do you mean?
Well, I don't know how many years the last.
So Yehoiakim was only king for 11 years before that.
So it could have been 19 years after.
But it says it's only 5 years into the exile. So we know it would only be 16 if that was the case. So it should be 16. It wouldn't work for 30. The last perspective is to work backwards instead of working kind of figuring out the Jubilee year from the end and then working back that it was the 30th year of the Yovel, is to actually just go back to what was going on. And so actually the year 30 years before this was when Yoshiyahu found the Torah. So if you go back to that story, which is in Perek Chaf Beis in Melachim Beis, so they find this Torah, and it's a pretty interesting page 939 and 9 to 941, and they bring it to Huldah Hanaviyah, if you recall, right, to the prophetess Huldah, and she says to them, right, if you look at verse 15, "Thus said Hashem, God of Israel, say to the man who sent you to me, thus said Hashem, behold, I am bringing evil upon this place and upon its inhabitants, namely all the words of the scroll the king of Judah read, because they have forsaken me and burned offerings to the gods of others in order to anger me with all of their handiwork," etc., etc. So Huldah gives this terrible kind of prophecy about the impending destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So some have argued that what's being referenced here in the 30th year is the 30th year since prophecies started declaring the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. So those are the gamut. Those are the three perspectives that I've come across thus far. That he was either 30 years old, and it has to do, and the way to highlight that is that it was about him being a prophet, 30 to 50. It's about the Yovel, and it was the message he was trying to send to the Jewish people, right, because of them being down and out, or that it was connection back to the destruction, and the destruction that was originally prophesied by in the time of Yoshiyahu, when Huldah Neviah kind of gives her prophecy here. So those are the three perspectives to how do you understand this opening salvo into the book.
And they're not mutually exclusive.
They're not mutually
They have to be
exclusive.
all consistent.
Especially the Yovel and the King Yoshiyahu. So it's they clearly, meaning Yoshiyahu finds the Sefer Torah on Yovel, right? Meaning if you're doing the math, right, it's the same year. Not that those things happen at the same time. In terms of the third perspective, that he's 30 years old, it's possible, right? We don't know, but it's possible that also could fit, but it's not. It wouldn't be. It doesn't necessarily fit. You could differentiate those, but yeah, they're not mutually exclusive. So we have a little extra time, but I think we're going to stop here because this is what I thought made sense to do the first day, and we'll pick up. Yes, question?
Just a quick,
Please.
interesting, and obviously, and maybe this is done, so you can enlighten me. But it's Vani b'tochagolah, so it's the first person, and it switches to third person.
Yeah.
So like that. So I don't know if this is something that's normally done. When you talked about the authorship, so that's why I'm
Yeah. I
kind of
understand.
wondering,
Yeah.
like, clearly something says I,
Right.
and clearly something says he.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if it was a compilation of both.
Yeah. I
From
think,
that, and that's just a.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the same thing when I was reading that. I'm not sure. I didn't see anyone like talk about it per se. I'm sure there are Rishonim who deal with the tenses. I did not have a chance to do a deep dive for that particular question, but I did notice it. I'm not sure.
That was odd. Like the first sentence, you don't even know who's talking.
Yeah.
You know.
It's
you
a
don't know
very
until-
strange
yeah.
introduction to the book.
Is he referring himself to third person? But it says ani b'tochagolah, so it means that he is, it seems to me he's right in the midst of it.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also, when you're saying that, you're kind of referencing that there's gonna be he realizes there's gonna be an end as well. When I'm right in the middle of the Golah.
And it's interesting. Most people view the first part of Yechezkel as more of a negative prophecy. The Gemara talks about the ordering of Tanakh, and there's a whole conversation about whether Yechezkel should come before or after Yeshayahu. Meaning who comes first. But the way that they justify having it Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, Yeshayahu is because Yirmiyahu is fully Chorban, Yechezkel is Chetzi, and Yeshayahu is fully Yeshua. So Yechezkel was the bridge between Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu, even though chronologically Yeshayahu probably took place before Yechezkel. So that's what the Gemara says in terms of why it's ordered in Tanakh this way. It says the same Gemara, Baba Basra, that talks about the authorship.
In the Chemi also. Took place before the Chemi also. So it's, all right.
Anyways, thank you,
Thank you
and
very
we'll pick
much.
up next week.
Feel better.